Campers of Reddit, what's the creepiest thing that happened to you in the wilderness or at a campsite? Posted one day ago. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Some random guy was shuffling through my shit at night. I was many hours into the wilderness in British Columbia. I stayed absolutely quiet and terrified in my sleeping bag in my tent, and he left after like 5 minutes. I had my pocket knife out in case he tried coming into my tent. I didn't sleep all night. In the morning, I got out and checked what was stolen, mostly food and batteries, so I thought he might just be doing this because he ran out of supplies, but he also took my $600 camera, so I guess not. When I was camping, I heard lots of rustling and noise during the night. I was alone in my tent, but there was 100% something moving outside. I was terrified, and I saw silhouettes of an animal in the distance moving. All of a sudden, I hear the biggest and deepest "moo" you've ever heard. A herd of free-range cows had found their way to me. One cow almost took down my tent, but it was all good. They were really chill. This was upstate New York, along the Canadian border. I wasn't camping, but I was out fly fishing one evening. It was right about that time when you look into the woods, it's pitch black. Outside of the bush, you could see relatively well. I was at my favorite spot, about halfway in the river, when on the opposite side in the woods, I could hear something walking. It was slow, somewhat methodical, and it just kept getting closer to me. I started hearing it about 100 feet away, and within 10 minutes, it had slowly advanced up to a set of rocks and shrubs right next to the river. All the while, if I heard a particularly loud stick break or leaf crunch, the steps or sounds would stop for a bit. At this point, I'd called out a few times, hoping it might be someone, but no response. Just this creepy feeling of being stared at. Being alone, unarmed, having recently seen a mountain lion a couple of kilometers away, no joke, I was a little on edge, so I backed out of the water, never turning my back. Fishing was good, so I hightailed it about half a kilometer down the river and went back to fishing. It wasn't long before I had the same eerie sounds of footsteps in the woods working their way up to me. At this point, I got the fuck out of there as quickly as possible. Hell, I didn't even change out of my waders in the parking lot. I jumped in the truck, drove a few miles down the road to a parking lot in town and changed there. About a week later, local papers reported a horse which had been attacked and suffered serious damage from what the vet described as an attack by a very large cat at a farm next to where I'd been fishing. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers around the US. Most often, I preferred to wild camp. An hour or so before dark, I'd start looking for somewhere to disappear into the woods for the night. Somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. A remote forest makes for far from a silent night's sleep. Think of all the crickets in a suburban neighborhood on a summer night and amplify that by about 1,000. There were always so many crickets and toads, and even the slightest breeze would stir music out of the tree leaves. Maybe I'd camped near a babbling creek, and it was always a highlight of the night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of distant coyotes. I can recall one night where I fell asleep to the sound of 2 nearby owls, one on either end of the tent, calling back and forth. One night in late September or early October, I was camping somewhere in the mountains of western Montana, and it was dead silent. There was not the slightest sound to be heard, not a single cricket, no nearby river or faraway coyotes. The dry leaves of autumn surely wouldn't have required a strong wind to stir their song, and yet there was only silence. It was terrifying. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. It felt as though the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. Suddenly, the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the cacophony of the forest, was like a gunshot. I slept terrible that night, and morning could not come soon enough. Mine's a little bit tame, but this is both the funniest experience and scariest experience I've had camping. Basic scene was camping with my family. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. It was a nice but big campsite in Northern California. It might have been some kind of church or something, I can't recall. Regardless, it was a big and full camp. I had woken up at the crack of dawn, and no, I'm not an early riser, but my bladder was not having any of that morning. I got up and went to the bathrooms, conveniently about 100 feet from my tent. My family was with me in the tent. It was a big 8-person, the ones that actually only fit like 4. I do my business and come on out, but hear movement. I stop for a second, but then reason my dad has gotten up since he is certainly an early riser. I start to head out and catch a glimpse of the source of the noise. It is brown and furry. My dad? Well, not quite. That aside, it was your friendly neighborhood California brown bear. I watched in a mix of curiosity and fear as the bear sat at the edge of our neighbor's campsite, tore off the top of their cooler, which they had kindly and stupidly left out. I watch as a bright yellow pack of hot dogs comes out and is removed from its packaging. This was a resident mama bear, we later found out. She knew her stuff. Upon eating the hot dogs, I then witnessed the weirdest thing I've ever witnessed in my entire life. The bear manages to pull out a beer, or some glass bottle, although it was more than likely beer or some hard drink from the cooler, and expertly pops off the cap by simply grabbing it in her teeth and bending it off, and proceeds to tilt its head back and drink what it could, and it promptly left. Honestly, I don't trust my memory fully, but that is to date my weirdest, funniest in hindsight, and scariest experience whilst camping. I used to camp pretty often at a wilderness spot that was a flat ridge on top of a big steep hill. One section had a trail that was steep but manageable, but the rest of this hill is almost vertical and would be impossible to climb without ropes and a bunch of climbing gear. Even though the top was flat, it was a heavily wooded area, thick pine trees, lots of underbrush, great views of the area, and far enough off the road we never saw other people. That particular trip, my girlfriend and best friend came along, so 3 of us spread out in 2 tents. Sometime in the middle of the night, a storm blew through and dropped about an inch of snow on our tents. It was a calm night without any wind and really peaceful, all zipped up in our own sleeping bags. When we woke up at first light, there was a distinct trail of human footprints in the snow that went all the way across the ridge, through our camp, and came about 2 feet from our tents. The crazy thing was, the footprints started from an area that would be impossible to climb up, and ended at another area that would be impossible to climb down, let alone in the dark with snow making the rocks slippery. We measured the footprints, and they were smaller than my friend and I's boots, too big to be my girlfriend's. Could never figure out how someone climbed up that section in the middle of the night, moved through the thick forest without making a sound, and came so close to our tents without anyone knowing. Creepy enough, we packed up pretty fast and got out of there. Not a scary story, but I was on this wilderness survival trip in college. All I brought was my clothes, water, a poncho, a knife, and a sleeping bag. I set up much further from the main camping area than the rest of my group since I wanted to enjoy being out there and away from human commotion. I slept directly on the ground in my sleeping bag and had a fairly pleasant night of sleep once I adjusted. However, when I woke up at first light, there was a huge cow with her calf standing directly over me and sniffing me. We stared at each other for a few minutes. Meanwhile, I didn't move an inch, so it felt like an eternity. The mother was stone cold frozen as I was, but the calf was careless, which only set us both off a bit. Eventually, they moved on peacefully, and it made me smile. A cow may not seem that scary, but being prone on the ground below it with its face the size of your chest inches away staring you down while protecting its child was pretty jarring to wake up to. Just after sundown, I drove up to my campsite on National Forest land in northeast Oregon and found 2 armed men attempting to steal my camp and camping gear, including my wall tent. I was solo and also armed, deer season. After a lot of tense negotiating, I got them to return most of my stuff, but they kept being shady and trying to flank me, so I told them to fuck off. I memorized the license plate and managed to get a conviction on one of the guys I was able to ID. He maybe did a weekend in jail. I got a small check from my homeowner's insurance and PTSD. My family and our dogs all went camping for a weekend, and on the first night there, probably around midnight or 1 a.m., a pack of wolves rounded our camp and were howling and prowling around for a good 30 minutes. They were so close that their howls were deafeningly loud. We were all wide awake, of course, and I remember my dad telling us to just be quiet and that the wolves were looking for our dogs most likely, as they'd spent the day running around the area and peeing on everything, so the wolves could definitely tell their territory had been disturbed by a strange animal. Our poor dogs were terrified, LMAO. They didn't make a single peep the whole time, despite being awake too. The fact we were all crammed into a tent and not safe inside a camp trailer made it much worse. My friend and I were at a gold claim on a river deep in the national forest. We had the campfire about 10 feet from the river, and the river was shallow at that point, but maybe 20 feet wide. On the other side, it was all heavy brush that steeply went up the mountainside. As we're sitting there, with only the fire for light, bullshitting and drinking, I looked at the river and saw two glowing eyes across the river in the bushes. They were fairly wide apart. Before we sat down an hour or so previously, we had been shooting our guns in the open area, so we had them all still on us or leaned against the chairs. I told the guys, and we all stood up and shot all the guns we had up in the air to scare it off. We heard a deep growl, grumble, then something crashing through the brush as it ran away. The next morning, we went over there to see if there were any paw prints and found a set of big bear tracks. The bear was summing us up to see if it could take us all at once or not. If not for the guns being shot, it may have charged. I was on a search and rescue training weekend. We specialized in locating downed private planes, so we were seriously in the middle of nowhere. Hours into the woods, we found an old abandoned lookout tower. The inside was covered in huge graphic paintings of animal sacrifices. The middle of the room had a pile of animal bones. The whole thing was unbelievably creepy. When I was younger, my family used to go camping every spring. Now, there wasn't much wilderness to speak of. The wildest thing I saw was a whole bunch of hares that leaped away when I tried to take a picture. So my parents would just let me and my brothers wander around wherever. One morning at sunrise, I woke up. Everyone else was still sleeping, which means I had to stay quiet. But I got bored and decided to go on an early morning stroll. When I got back, the rest of my family was having breakfast in front of the tent, and they looked at me very confused. I was like, what? Turns out everyone thought I was still in the tent until I casually came strolling up to them from the other side of the campsite. My parents said that they had called me for breakfast, but that I mumbled something and didn't come. My younger brother claimed that he had heard me turning in my bed just a few minutes ago. I went into the tent to investigate. There was no one in my part of the tent. All my stuff appeared to be untouched. We shrugged it off. Obviously, there had been some sort of mistake or collective brain fart. However, when I needed to be somewhere that evening, I went and grabbed my flashlight, and it didn't work. I opened it up to see what the problem was, and the batteries were missing. I checked my parents' flashlights, no batteries. I checked my brother's flashlights, no batteries. We were quite spooked, and for the rest of that stay, I never strayed far from the tent. Had just come back from a hike, and we were going to cool off in the creek. Girlfriend was already in when I heard gunshots, real close. Nobody else seemed to be freaked out by this, and it was probably someone shooting in the open field beyond the tree line. It stopped pretty quick. Maybe someone told them they were being idiots. Actually glad that I heard them, because I knew then the sound that woke me up at 4 a.m. in the morning wasn't a gunshot, but probably the trash lids being lifted up and slammed down. Then a rustling sound for a while, so probably a bear. Either way, my mind went to all sorts of scary scenarios. We rented mountain bikes and planned to ride from the jungle nearby Cairns to Cooktown, Australia. The maps we looked at didn't indicate several mountains in the way. We didn't believe we needed a tent, but grabbed it as a precaution. Before internet, always find topographical maps before going off, lol. The roads were dusty dirt and gravel. It hadn't rained in weeks in the rainforest. It was great going for a while, but I was concerned when we crossed some dry riverbeds. After 3 hours of riding through mountains, we realized it was a much longer ride than anticipated. Then it rained heavily, so hard that we couldn't see much more than 20 meters. Luckily, we came upon a campsite, but it appeared to be abandoned. A guy in a camper van gave us water to drink. I can't remember ever being so thankful for water. It felt so precious. We set up camp there. The tent had no fly to protect us from the rain. We only had granola and peanut butter as food. At some point in the night, we heard something outside our tent moving about. We had seen wild boar running across the road as we cycled. Maybe that's what it was. We realized that whatever it was probably smelled of granola. A basketball-sized bulge was forming inside our tent. The bulge just stayed there, unmoving, as we stared at it for 15 minutes, only whispering in fear within the tent. After a while of watching the bulge, I finally took my foot and started pushing the bulge out with it, expecting a sudden sound or attack. The bulge returned again. Whatever it was, it probably wasn't heavier than 10 pounds. It felt like a rump. Something was sitting on our tent. Eventually, it disappeared. We decided to push on later, but dry riverbeds became rushing rivers. My friend had walked into a stinging bush while trying to find a safe place to cross a river. Apparently, these bushes can be deadly. He only went pale, but seemed okay. I was shaking, feeling cold from just being wet for so long. It was still a hot jungle, which made no sense to me. A few jeeps had stopped at one rushing river, waiting for it to calm. Luckily, one offered us a ride back. At the time, it seemed like one of the worst things I ever experienced. Yet, oddly, there was a side of us that completely enjoyed the experience.